In an age of fear, instability, and paranoia, in a society filled with crime, violence, and hate, there's always hope, light, and the opportunity for good. Heroes. The concept of the superhero is ancient. Achilles, Hercules, Perseus, survivors, fighters, knights. Now we turn the page to face the challenge of a new age. A new set of questions. We invite you to the conversation and to watch Superhero Chat!
Hello and welcome to the Superhero Chat from the campus of Fayetteville State University. I'm your host, Professor Jonathan Chestnut from the Department of Performing and Fine Arts. We have three outstanding panelists for today's show. To my right is Dr. Cary Adkinson, a professor from the Department of Criminal Justice, Dr. Heather Griffiths, a professor from the Department of Sociology, and Ian Murphy, a student from the Department of Criminal Justice. Welcome. Today, during Free Talk, we're going to discuss comic book to movie adaptations, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Let me start with a brief list of recent comic books made to movies. Superman, Batman, Green Lantern, Fantastic Four, Avengers, X-Men, Watchmen, X-Men, there's like 4 or 5 of them, Sin City, Ghost Rider, Punisher, there's like 4 or 5 of those, Spider-Man, what are we at, 4, 5?
4.
Incredible Hulk, Spawn, and the list just goes on. So, what works? What doesn't work? And what can we expect in the future? I take this to the panelists. What do y'all think about these movies?
Oh, well, clearly Green Lantern sucked.
Don't be hating on Green Lantern.
I only speak the truth. It was overplotted and underacted.
Alright, so we hate Green Lantern.
I see there's only going to be basically 2 ways that this can go. Either they're going to continue to be popular, or the audiences are just going to get so burned out with, basically the superhero comic movie, and they're going to have to move on to other things that have been inspired by comics that may be more like dramas or crime things like Road to Perdition or History of Violence, and they're just going to have to keep milking it until eventually you run out of material to work with.
I think that one of the things that's going to keep the comic book movies popular is what's going on in our culture, because these are movies of escapist fantasy where we kind of put our hopes and dreams onto these characters in the movies, and as long as we're kind of experiencing things like war and economic downturns where we look at our own personal private lives and kind of wish for bigger and better things, I think the movies are always going to be popular.
Well, that's reasonable. I can see where we're going with the idea of superhero movies, speaking back to the hero motif in our society and the need for good to overcome bad, that kind of thing. So what makes a good superhero movie? We've seen, you didn't like Green Lantern, but what makes a good one?
Good casting. You cast the right person, you're going to have a good movie.
But the cast for the Fantastic Four was outstanding.
I disagree. Jessica Alba is a lightweight. She's pretty to look at, but she can't act her way out of a paper bag. Now I'm talking about casting Patrick Stewart as Professor X. Dream casting.
That's true.
Michael Fassbender as a young, hot, murderous Magneto.
He was pretty hot.
Can't deny it. Man's got charisma.
Yeah, and I think to kind of piggyback on that, I think that a big part of that, once you get the right casting, the storylines, I think those are really important. And I think it's really important not just for the comic book geeks that are kind of wanting to see the representations of their favorite heroes on screen, but also for the general public. I think it's important to stay very true to the source material. The reason that these heroes became popular in the first place is because they were in comic book form, and that's where they gained their popularity, and their origins, the challenges they face, the mythos of these characters is what people want to see on the screen, because it speaks to something very deep and important about being a human being, I think.
It's kind of just finding this nice balance between what comic fans would want to see in a movie versus what the director would want to make or the writer wants to make, because you get films like the Christopher Nolan Batman films. Mm-hmm. They change a lot about these characters, motivations and things like that, but they're some of the most popular and well-received superhero movies out there right now.
I think there's also a combination of, you have to have action in your superhero movies. Usually there's some type of romantic, involvement that kind of brings in maybe not necessarily just the young male audience, but you also have these world-breaking storylines where there's a great sense of peril. I mean, the last Batman movie, we're talking about nuclear explosions destroying cities, and of course the X-Men. I mean, characters who have their individual powers can destroy cities. So I think it kind of hooks the readers in because they're seeing stories that are of kind of great import.
And I think it's really important to stick with the targeted stories. You have something like the Dark Phoenix saga that went on for 50 issues.
Yeah, it was quite a run.
You try to make that into a movie and fail miserably. Just can't be done adequately. You try to make it into a cartoon miniseries. It's too complicated. There's too much history there.
But it's interesting to see how a lot of they're actually, before the first movie is even out, there's a planned trilogy, so it's like the first Batman comes out and they're already having ideas because they know the movies are going to sell and be popular. But you see things like the recent reboot of the Spider-Man franchise. I mean, when they went into this, their whole idea was a 3-movie trilogy, and so of course they're trying to sell, and that's going to build up people's expectations. But I think that's something that you'll see in the future is set trilogies, because I guess people like the number 3. Not sure what that is, but yeah.
Well, I know Star Wars is now going to be heading up to 9. That's what they're planning for the next 3. I mean, so when we start thinking about these, I mean, when did comic books become mainstream? I mean, when I was in high school, if you read comics, you hid them in your locker. But now it's a badge of honor to be a superhero nerd geek. And yet, when did that happen? How did that transition happen? What changed in our society to make superhero movies the blockbusters instead of the flops that they were in, say, like the 70s?
I think it has a lot to do with the technology we have now. We can do a good superhero movie now. I know that was an issue Marvel had for the longest time because they had a lot of the big superhuman things. And even just with Superman, making him fly was a big deal and used in its promotion. I can't remember the exact line, but it's like, "You'll believe a man can fly," or something like that.
For the first time, you'll believe a man can fly.
And I think now we're actually getting the funding and the technology to actually make these look believable and look realistic for it. And they're some of the biggest forms of escapism you can have out there. I mean, you can watch a romance and they could be corny and cheesy, but they're still normal people in relatively normal circumstances. These are people doing superhuman things, and it's just something that you can go to. You spend, ever how much money you want, and you can just be entertained.
I think some of it has to do with the rise of the internet. That we have at our fingertips now. You don't have to be a comic book aficionado or a comic book geek. You don't have to go to a comic book store. All you have to do is get online, and there's websites, fan sites, and all these kind of things. So the proliferation of superheroes throughout our culture, I think that kind of gives it a real shot in the arm.
Digital distribution of
comics. Yeah, absolutely.
I think my take from it was always the fact that with the internet, people with disposable incomes weren't the only ones with access to comic stories anymore. People were able to get comics and backstories and histories and not have to spend a whole lot of money to be committed to it. Because when I was young, if you wanted to be a comic book collector, you had a significant financial input.
It's expensive, and it takes up a lot of space.
Yeah. Tell my wife about it.
I mean, the average still is $3, isn't it?
Yeah, it's $4
$3.99. Yeah. All right, it's now time to answer questions from our fans. The first one comes from Becky, a Facebook fan. I'll start with Cary as our first panelist for this question. Which is more important in superhero movies, the story or the art? Or it's actually comics or movies.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think, I'm trying not to be wishy-washy here, but I think it's a combination of both. Now, if you have a great storyline and great characterization, you might be able to get away with maybe not as kind of fancy rendered, comics and things of that nature. And we do see that, some of the more popular storylines of the 30s and 40s, you compare those to the art of today, and it's light years beyond what the simple figure drawings of the earliest comic books. But at the same time, if you don't have some compelling story or a compelling mythos that really draws people in, for example, with Spider-Man, he was described as a hero who could be you. So even if you don't have the best art, or if you're not a fan of the art, if you feel like you can identify with the character, that's what's going to pull you into the comic books, and by extension, that's what's going to pull you into the movies as well.
I think it falls almost under, it's subjective. what I like is not the same thing you would like. But I think it's if you're looking at it under a reader's perspective or a marketing perspective for it. If I'd say under marketing, the art's very important, because really all you have when you look at the comic is you have the logo for it and then you have the cover, especially in shops that may pre-bag the books and not let you actually look at them before you buy them. Yeah. But the story is important because that's what's going to keep your readership going in it. I've canceled a lot of books because I didn't enjoy the story involved in it, and I've read a lot more books that had really good stories and horrible art in it, in my opinion.
And sometimes it's really jarring if you have a favorite artist and they leave the book, and then the next artist that comes on, you just might, again, like you said, subjective, but if you don't like their work as much, you might end up not liking the book itself.
Right.
Well, just like with a movie, I can ignore bad CGI effects if the story's good and the acting's good. I mean, that, who was it who did that run of Uncanny X-Men? Was it Quesada? Where everybody just ended up looking like blocks? Good stories, though, good writing. So I stuck with it.
Well, for me, because I teach art and I'm kind of focused on the art of comics is what's drawn and kept me in it for years. Art can be very theme related as well. Think like Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns. Had that been done by, say, George Perez, an ultra-realistic, detail-oriented artist, it wouldn't have had the same emotional impact that the solid black lines, the dark backgrounds, the abstracted forms had. So artistically, the art led to the story, which was where the characters were abstracted. They even make the concept or the comment when he sees Superman in the distance. He says that we are now gods to these people. We are giants among mice, and it's basically looking at ourselves, at the superheroes, as becoming abstracted forms, and that's how they were rendered, these huge, giant, hulking creatures in this world of very tiny little people, frail. And so I think the art can kind of balance it out that way. But there's also things like Cancer Vixen, which she couldn't draw. She had like little stick figures and stuff like that, but her story was so compelling because it was the story of a woman that got breast cancer, and she did a comic book telling her life story about it. And the fact that it was homemade and it had that sort of intimate interaction. So I think either way, the art can win it or lose it depending on.
As long as the art tells a story, and that's what the great, even if their art is not fancy art, as long as it tells a good story, I think, and they know how to put together ideas in that fashion. I think that's what's important.
That's cool. All right, our second question comes from Beth, another Facebook fan, and let's start with Heather. What is the coolest superpower to have?
It's the easiest question in the world to answer.
It is?
Generally speaking, it's mind powers, but more specifically, the power to cloud the mind, to make people perceive whatever you want them to perceive. Classic Hellfire mastermind. He did that. He subverted the Phoenix. Okay? I don't need to be able to strike you down physically to make you think you're being burned alive. And there's a mind-body connection. So if I can get into your head and make you think that you're burning, then you're going to collapse. I win. You lose.
That's simultaneously the coolest of the superpowers, but also the one that has the most kind of complex moral implications to it. I mean, getting in somebody's head, free will, and from criminal justice perspective, that's the essence of our criminal justice system, that you had the right to make a choice. And so if we're getting into things where one person can control the thoughts of other people, I mean, that's some pretty serious business.
I'd pretty much be a supervillain. Yeah. But none of you would be able to take me out because you would just not even see me.
Well, you just make us perceive you as a good guy.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
So what are you thinking? What would be your favorite superpower?
I don't know. Honestly, it would either be, like invulnerability or immortality in some way. I mean, you kind of need both of them in order for them to actually be decent, because it would still suck to get hurt, but live forever with it. But, I mean, I look at this under a thing, like so many of the superheroes I like actually don't have powers. I'm a fan of Batman, Iron Man, Green Arrow, where they're very tech-heavy versus, being able to fly or being invulnerable, heat vision, anything like that, mind powers. And I think that's what attracts it to me, is I'm drawn less to the idea of superpowers and more towards the regular guy or the wealthy guy going out and making his powers, and somebody who's still vulnerable still can die, and still can die pretty easily.
Yeah, I was always partial. I mean, Spider-Man's always been my favorite character, you know, and so I'm a little bit biased there. But I was always partial to characters that didn't have the invulnerability because they, you know, it was always kind of hard for me to kind of identify with Superman. Although his powers were awesome and cool and all that, it was hard for me to identify with him. Plus, it always seemed like, you know, despite all the problems that Peter Parker or Spider-Man was having, it seemed like when he put the costume on and was swinging through the city and sticking to walls and doing all those acrobatic moves, it just seemed like he was having the time of his life. I mean, those are the types of powers I'd like to have, just to be able to do cool stuff like that.
I could give you the illusion that you could do cool stuff
well,
like
see,
that.
I could sit at home eating Cheetos on my couch and in my head be doing all kinds of cool stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah, awesome.
That's why I read comics, is because then it's happening in my head.
Well, there you
I'm
go.
happy.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. For me, I guess I would always, the mental power is always a good thing. I always think super intelligence, you know, because then not only can I cure the problems, you know, but make my life a better place. You know, get on the stock market, make myself rich, build the Iron Man armor, so I can emulate super strength, so I don't have to actually have it. You know, make a helmet to keep her from messing with me.
As long as it doesn't come with a bald head or like a super gigantic head.
I already got that part. So, and you know, if you ask my mom, I had a huge head when I was a kid. So, why didn't I get the powers? So I got the mutations.
Yeah, the physical mutation, but not the power.
That's right. Our last and third and last question comes from Charnel, and I'll start with Ian. Why do female superheroes always seem to be overtly sexualized?
I think that has to do just with who they're being targeted at. I mean, a lot of, you know, comics are directly targeted towards teenagers, specifically teenage boys. Most of them are written by men, with the exceptions of Gail Simone, and that's really the only one I know off the top of my head. A lot of it's being drawn by men. So I just think it's people are drawing and writing and selling what they want to see and what they want to sell.
So what do y'all think?
Oh, well, you know, I would question the premise to begin with. You know, classic X-Men characters like Jubilee and Kitty Pryde, they were teenage girls. They were not overtly sexualized. In fact, they wore layers and layers of clothes. I mean, at one point, Kitty Pryde was roller skating in her spandex. You know, so there is that attempt to appeal to young girls looking for positive role models without giving them body image issues.
I mean, again, I kind of agree with what you're saying. I mean, it's one of these things where, you know, maybe the question should be more directed towards both sexes. I mean, superhero comic books tend to dramatize just the human figure. I mean, Superman, Spider-Man. I mean, you can just start naming character after character. The Hulk. I mean, very few comic book characters, at least the most popular ones, are shown wearing thick, you know, sweaters and sweatpants and stuff like that. They're always wearing form-fitting, hugging clothes that accentuates, you know, not just the female form, but also the rippling abs of the male, or the chest, the deltoids, and all those kind of things, the buttocks, you know, you name it. I mean, it just seems like superhero comics in general accentuate what, you know, for lack of a better term, would be the ideal physical form of the human being.
We actually, in the art area, refer to it as heroic proportions.
Okay.
Moving to, you know, the Greek god myth out, you know, the way Michelangelo rendered David and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. And when you look at that, like, through artistic history, that's what you see. You know, you do see, you know, periods in time where the women were more plump and things of that nature. But that was more of a, I think, a byproduct of that was seen as in those days a sign of that you were prosperous.
Yeah, it's a financial byproduct.
Yeah, financial byproduct. But in terms of just the artistic expression, it's always the idealized version of the male and female form. But then I also think, you know, you're on the right track as well, that, you know, geek guys like to see voluptuous women, I guess.
Well, and actually, it was in the 70s when they took away Wonder Woman's powers and they put her in a full body suit.
Mm-hmm.
There were actually women groups that protested it. That, you know, they felt like, you know, she was the one powerful superhero woman that was being played down, and she went back to the Linda Carter costume, and
plus it's a classic costume design.
Yeah,
yeah.
And they've tried to change it, and they've actually they've modernized it, and sometimes they get a little far, then they come back. So her costume's changed more than any of the other two in the Trinity of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman.
Do you remember when Marvel Comics put out a 12-month pinup calendar of all the chicks?
Swimsuit issues.
Yeah, swimsuit issues.
Mm-hmm.
A few years in a row.
Those sold pretty. I worked at a comic book store at the time when those were really big, and they sold out.
Oh yeah,
You know, pretty much lickety split. You know,
they're very pretty.
A lot of the actually Marvel did it, and then there was like a few other of the minor comic book companies put them out too.
I think Jim Lee had his own.
Yeah.
You know, calendar there. Okay.
All right. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Thank you to my panelists, Dr. Cary Adkinson, Dr. Heather Griffiths, and Ian Murphy. I'm your host for Superhero Chat, Professor Jonathan Chestnut. And remember, you don't have to be super to be a hero. Until next time, take care.